panel, when something is in your economic interest, you should probably do that thing. First of all, setup, and then second of all, why this is an immediate economic benefit and in the interest of China. First of all, to set up, what do we defend in this world? First of all, we defend removing merger barriers for China, being using like CCP officials to negotiate measures, and third of all, other economic incentives. Second of all, what is the status quo then? First of all, it is a domestic car market that is struggling to compete against international firms. Second of all, it is losing market share. That is to say, other international firms are pushing Chinese domestic car producers out, and competing metrics of domestic car producers are making them less efficient and losing out to these larger firms. Third thing to say is that international car manufacturers use China because it is cheap and close to resources. And this creates a couple of bad things for China. First of all, profits leave the economy. Third of all, what are in China's interests in this case? A, it is growing and sustaining economic growth. I think it is really important to point out here the current economic context that China exists within. Economic growth within China is currently slowing down. Therefore, the CCP is interested in anything that they can do to prop up markets to keep economic growth constant. Second of all, it has interests on monopolies in general. This looks like it's monopoly on tech through firms like Huawei and telecommunications. This is a revealed preference. We know just from the info slide that this is something that the CCP has previously done and that they have fiat to do in this case. Third of all, it is in the interests of exporters to consume higher goods and services, right? That looks like China's domestic interests is to provide more in goods and services to its people, but also to have dominance in the goods and services market. Fourth of all, what does China compete against? First of all, it looks like conglomerates in other international markets. This looks like the Volkswagen Group, this looks like the Daimler Group, this looks like Toyota, this looks like GM. These are all major international car producers. They have all conglomerated in the past. This is a revealed preference. China must do it now. Second of all, it is to say that now these large firms that are already conglomerated that China has to compete against have more ability to do R&D because their costs are lower. Third of all, they have supply chain integration. That is what China is competing against in this case. So first of all, onto my first argument. Why is this in the immediate economic interest of China? Well, first thing here is why this is likely to be successful. The first thing to say here is that Chinese EV companies have an interest in merging as they do not want to lose market share. This is pretty intuitive, right? B is to say that there is received wisdom from conglomeration. I think we just have to look at external car markets around the world to see this. At the point in which you buy up other firms, at the point in which you conglomerate, you now have a greater ability to integrate supply chains, you now have a greater ability to conduct R&D. This has flow-on effects in terms of reduced costs. Third of all is to say the CCP has a great power to compel this. First of all, what does this mean? What does this mean for car manufacturers in general? This means that the policy is likely to be received well, because we've previously seen in cases of mergers and acquisitions within China that these are typically received well by the CCP, whether that be Alibaba or Huawei tech conglomerates. Why do the CCP have imminent incentives to do this? The extent and a mandated incentive to do this. First of all, they are the only ones that can control the barriers in terms of mergers and acquisitions within China. That is to say that companies cannot merge to the same ability in free markets around the world, such as in America. The CCP has to act on this to allow it to occur. B is to say that at the point in which you allow tax incentives and other forms of ways for this to occur, it reduces the merger cost. That is to say that when the CCP implements things such as tax breaks or handouts to car companies that want to merge, that reduces the cost of that merger. The third thing is to say here that the CCP can centrally plan the economy so it is conducive for mergers to work. We have previously seen this. This is a demonstrated thing through other tech firms like Huawei, but we also think since it is a centrally planned economy, even in the case where that wasn't previously the case, it can still work. 3, why is this proven to work, and what are the benefits? The first thing to say here is that the company now has merged and has economies of scale and lower costs than previously. This means that just generally manufacturing cars becomes less expensive. B is they can sell more to international markets. Note here that an increase in cheap vehicles that an increase in cheap vehicles in international markets is an innate good. This is because both government policy and domestic consumer preferences has now changed towards electric vehicles. But the problem that currently exists in markets like the EU, America, and Australia is the market lockout in terms of the pricing for vehicles. So at the point in which China can provide vehicles for a cheaper price, they cop the benefit of now having established market dominance within those markets and now have market control. Fourthly then, now as China, you can get the increased tax revenue from these higher profiteering companies and from these exports. This is pretty intuitive, right? And we want to note here that China can enforce strict corporate tax laws on these companies and on these merged companies, as we have previously seen, because companies must be incorporated within China to get that. So that is something that is an immediate benefit in terms of the international market, but also in terms of tax revenue for the government. As China, the impact here is that as China, raising more money is pretty good for you. This looks like a couple of things. It looks like you can currently stimulate your slowing down economy. It means you can prop up the property market that has failed within China, but it also means more broadly, you can probably pump this money back into those same industries, establish global market dominance, and then have a monopoly over global car market supply, such as we've seen with the manufacturing of iPhones from Foxtel. That is a pretty good thing in terms of China and the CCP's interest in terms of global hegemony and control. B, you now can compete with international manufacturers on a much larger and better scale. This leads to a couple of impacts here. This means that you can, first of all, drown out international competitors from your domestic market. That means that you're more likely to have an imminent control over what domestic consumers consume. It also means that your car companies are more likely to succeed in the long run, because at the point in which you now have that domestic market control, you now can be assured that of the 1 billion people living in China, that you can probably sustain that growth. But you also probably have here some level of control over things such as the Belgian Road Initiative and the way that manufacturing and exports work within that industry. At the point in which you are able to be the primary supplier of the cars within those markets, you now establish longer term market benefits. But this also works out in the short term in quite a pernicious and in quite a good way for China. Because at the point in which you do that, you can now win over international markets, you now have longer term security, and that is really in both your short term and long term interests there. D, you can now incorporate with international car companies. At the point in which you have domestic hegemony and a larger impact within the domestic markets, you can now, also buy out external firms, which is really, really good for your own company. It means you have more international market dominance there. And it also means that, you can probably start to remove things such as the tax breaks and the other incentives that you've previously put in for these companies to make them work. So at the end of this argument, what do you have? You have that it is within the economic interests of China to pursue these policies. It is both in the interests of the firms themselves, but also the general government and people. It means you have increased tax revenue, increase in export markets, and an increase in the domestic market, side with affirmative.
The CCP has a revealed preference to force mergers in all other industries as per the info slide. You must ask yourself, why have they not done it here? And this is because things are currently working. They are immensely successful. They will continue to be successful in future. This debate occurs within the car industry, where diversity was crucial. It was never as affirmative claims here. In your economic interest to do this, it was pretty clear that negative was always going to take this win. Several things in my speech today. Firstly, 3 critical points of setup. Secondly, point on diversification and why we claim so many benefits here. Thirdly, why this intervention spurs US response. Let's start with setup. We would just like to start here with the interests of China, which is to say that the primary interest of the CCP, above and beyond its international image necessarily, is maintaining domestic support and stability, which meant that it wanted to maintain its power within this country. It wanted to reduce dissent from its government. The CCP, we thought, conceptualizes support and stability through 2 main things. The first is to say firstly, economic stability, which is to say that when they have been under threat, this has often been tied to economic instability. For example, like the Great Leap Forward, which is to say that they will prioritize they would prioritize stability over leaps and bounds in growth. They weren't willing to necessarily risk this. So it is not necessarily the number one priority to have economic growth. It is not as straightforward as this. Stability along this process was important, and if a firm doesn't have this, it loses them the debate. The second thing, though, was they cared about their general populace, which is to say that they wanted their populace to have access to cheap consumer goods. It kept them happy. Having like a car for a low amount of money is pretty good. The third thing, though, is just to say that finally, that we are like debating in the status quo, which is to say that, especially as per the info slide, that this is working, it is successful. The other team asserts that like countries are pushing China out here. This is not the case. China, note here, is like a world leader. They are ahead here by miles. Do not discount this in your analysis. Do not let affirmative underplay how significant this was in this debate. Let's move on to some arguments. Firstly, why we claimed so many benefits on side negative that came from diversification, and unfortunately for affirmative, this is what they lost in this debate. Which is to say, firstly here, you actually got competition between companies, and because each of these are actively trying to get market share from one another within China. Note here that the domestic market was very, very large. There was large capacity for competition here, and this is why it was meaningful. It was quite rewarding for these companies to actively beat out the rest. What this meant is that under side negative, these separate companies were nowhere near as inefficient as having one large monopoly within your country. We think that this is pretty intuitive. Trust your gut here. And despite what affirmative tries to sell you, they never claim their benefits on reduced price here. We think the competition metric is so significant, you should weigh this highly. But the other key benefit here was just that you were able to get better quality cars at a lower price because otherwise your consumers just turn towards a multitude of other options. We thought that Chinese consumers loved this. This was one of your utmost priorities as the CCP. The next thing though, and the second thing, is to talk about supply chains. Affirmative talks about how they reduce the cost here, but we would like to stress to you again that we live in a particular era of uncertainty, especially to do with supply chains. So for example, this looks like Congo recently backlashing against Chinese companies mining cobalt there, which is to say that supply chains can be quite volatile, they can be quite unpredictable, which is to say that as a result of this, we would always prioritize a world where we saw diversification within these supply chains, where companies were able to buy supply from different sources. The benefit here again was this sense of stability, which is that under affirmative side, once one supply goes down, your entire market has a higher chance of collapsing. Again, it is beneficial to have a range of companies here, to have greater diversification within supply chains. The third thing here is to say that again, this debate occurs within the specific instance of the car industry, which we think affirmative necessarily misses. You cannot ignore that uniquely here, different companies just maintain different images for their product and for their cars, which was incredibly important to consumers when they were deciding what product to buy into. This was crucial, and it actually drove up sales. It meant that people thought that they had more choice between cars. It meant that they felt empowered when they got a certain sports car as opposed to a different form of car. This was really important. When you necessarily merge these companies together, you lost that insane benefit. The fourth thing to say here is that we just hedge our bets, because companies can often go down, they are unpredictable, your infrastructure can be ruined or can be unreliable. Again, our side is the side that necessarily offers you less risk. This was crucial to CCP interests. Again, economic stability was always going to outweigh what was at the end of the day a very, at their best, a very marginal amount of economic growth. We think that on side negative, we are able to win the debate from this point alone. But let's go further here, which is to talk on my second point, why this intervention saw a very, very grave US response, why this was directly against your interests. We would say under the status quo, that a lot of this operation has just gone underneath the radar. We don't think it draws a significant amount of attention. We don't think it bears insane relevance in, for instance, US politics, which is to say that you currently have this insane benefit of just operating within what's a pretty tranquil environment where you have more freedom to do what you want to do, where you have less scrutiny on your every move. Now what necessarily happens under side affirmative is that this becomes actually a very significant part of the news. It instantly becomes a foreign matters in countries such as the US. You draw attention to something without a clear benefit or without a clear economic growth for yourself. We think particularly because affirmative says that the CCP forces this actually like builds the amount of opposition that this gets on the international level. But we would say secondly, now that now this company, this like big like monopoly is just like perceived as like the Chinese state company. So we think that the affirmative like tells you China can like centrally plan things and this is a benefit. They point you to the example that is Huawei like phones. We think that this is a crippling example of the affirmative case because how is Huawei like perceived on the international like scale? It is perceived in the US, for instance, to be the Chinese phone. It builds like large opposition against Huawei. Like you see just like this like very easy like mode of like US aggression. It is like constantly like referenced and like opposed. We would say this extends to other companies that aren't even necessarily Chinese, but just associated with being a Chinese app. Like TikTok is seen as like being the Chinese social media company. It's not even Chinese and builds such like aggression against it because of this like sole reason. Which is to say that now you like have this huge harm in that your big like car monopoly is just seen internationally as the Chinese threat and something that necessarily like requires like action against. This was incredibly harmful to you. Again, point you to the status quo where you have freedom to operate and do what you want without an insane amount of scrutiny. Unclear as to why on affirmative you would like want to lose this, which is just to say that there is pretty like bipartisan consensus in the US that of like attacking China, particularly through companies that are perceived to be representing the entire country. The consequence of this is that you just get way more like foreign direct like product regulations. This meant that your big company was just like less efficient. The cost drove up to do anything. Again, making that any economic benefit they claim like even more like marginal. You drew like media attention. This got blown out of proportion. At the end of the day, the status quo was working. China was a world leader here. They were so significantly ahead of other countries. You threw this all away when you bought into side affirmatives model. You must vote side negative.
Two things in this speech. Firstly, a discussion of the economic benefits and which side benefits the most under the situation. And then secondly, a discussion of like international markets and political saliency and how this is actually going to increase China's influence overseas and how it's actually going to influence the success of their companies overseas and the perception of China overseas. Firstly, on this topic of economic benefits, what's negative side provide? They provide three main points. Firstly, this is a discussion of like diversification in terms of like the car industry. Second is how the competition mechanism actually functions and how it is functioning well apparently in China because it is keeping prices low through this and that this is a market that is conducive to a competitive environment. And then thirdly, a discussion of like supply chain and whether or not this is going to be the case. Firstly, then on the car industry and diversification. I think it's important to recognize, right, that monopolies in general just do allow for cheaper goods due to the nature of high fixed costs in the car industry, right? I think when we're looking at particular industries and whether or not we should analyze whether it should be a competitive market or whether it should be a monopoly, right, it is clearly quite simple to just look at the revealed reality of what has occurred in terms of like already existing petroleum markets, right? In terms of like petroleum cars. These cars have tended towards natural monopolies, large conglomerations of several companies for several reasons outlined to you at 1A, right? Including things like the fact that there's technology sharing benefits, including things like you have the high fixed cost, which is the burden initially, the high barrier of entry, which prevents the existence of dozens and dozens and dozens of companies able to enter the market when this competition metric fails, right? All of these reasons are essential to the fact that this is, in general, a market that is more tailored towards natural monopolies, right? So, importantly, the CCP has the capacity as well and incentives to regulate domestic prices in this instance, right? So, the problem with monopolies in general is that sometimes companies will spike up prices once they have gained significant market share. We analyze at 1A, right, that this is actually to the benefit of China internationally, because once they have grown to have significant international market share through the reduction of prices, in the long run, they're able to actually have control of this market and increase prices to the extent that they're able to like profit in these instances. right? But importantly, the CCP tends to have control over domestic policy and over domestic price mechanisms, which allows them, therefore, to provide incentives to regulate domestic prices and maintain cheap prices for Chinese consumer goods, right? They then discussed about like, oh, well, stability in this case is actually the higher priority because stability is the focus as opposed to growth and all of this, right? But it is far simpler for the CCP to regulate a single or a few, an oligopolistic market, right, than it is to regulate a market filled with dozens and dozens of competing firms, right? This is just because of simple reasons of like they have fewer leadership programs to discuss with, right? They have fewer different markets to observe. They just have a simple few companies that they're able to control and have some influence over, which provides more stability over the long run, right? I think then on this issue of like the supply chain, right? They try to tell you that, oh, because this is going to be one company, they're going to be entirely dependent on a single supplier, right? Can we sense check this for a second, right? If they're going to produce as many as dozens and dozens of corporations, right? They are going to have to require as many mining manufacturers as those dozens and dozens of corporations, right? KFC does not have a single chicken provider in that instance, right? They have to require this from different companies and different organizations or different mining corporations, right? Importantly, under our side though, it is simplified because now rather than the mining corporations and international mines having the competition metric of like, oh, different Chinese corporations are competing against each other for prices, therefore lithium prices are increasing, right? Now you have a monopoly where you have control over which mining corporations you choose, right? You are forcing them to compete against each other for your business because they're dependent on your business, and as a result, you are actually going to have a supply chain that is more in general dependent on your whims and whatever you decide. Right. Continuing on economic benefits, right? The existence of like we've already outlined, right, that it just reduces the cost of production and reduces prices, right? But what additional future benefits do exist under the situation? Importantly, firstly, is that China now receives cheaper deals on important minerals for batteries and for renewables. I think the context here is extremely crucial, is that China has made a push to be one of the larger or largest environmental energy investors. There are significant amounts of investment into this space, and as a result, probably are desiring significantly like deals in terms of like trade deals with other nations and mining corporations in terms of this. Through the new investing leverage that they have, right? They now have this like leverage over these lithium companies, leverage over these instances where they're now able to extract better deals, not only for the electronic vehicle companies, but also are able to extract leverage for other Chinese goods, right? Because of the fact that like the CCP is just like directly involved with a lot of its largest corporations, does have that political influence, right? They're now able to incentivize these corporations, the electric vehicle corporations, to extend that leverage that they have to other corporations, which just benefits like the larger industries or the technology industries in China as a whole, all of which are in the active interest of China. Now on political saliency, right? Firstly, we kind of get this like discussion of like now China is able to, in general, actually produce corporations that are going to be respected and seen on the global market and are going to be like highly well perceived. Side negative tries to tell you, no, if we look at like Huawei and we look at things like that, right, in the US specifically, these are viewed as Chinese businesses, and that was like tied with negative perceptions. I think it's really important to very quickly sense check this, right? In terms of like phones and technology, in almost all markets, maybe excluding the US, but all international markets, right, affordability is the most important thing. And in the short run, a monopolistic China is able to lower prices and lower prices on like electric vehicles and compete more effectively, right? But if we look at the Huawei example, right, phones are used throughout like Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, right? Neg needs to explain why this is crippling in the face of low costs, right? In this way up in terms of like future mines. In terms of then the US-China relationship, it is already like at a horrible stage, right? The world is larger than the US, and China has recognized this in the vast majority of its political responses, right? It's recognized this with its decision to go with the BRI because it has decided to do these things. Note that China has also been unable to do the BRI more recently because of the fact that its growth has slowed down, which is something that this is able to actively address, and we're actively able to solve. On this idea of political saliency as well. Right? It's important to note that they're now able to engage in research and development at a capacity that is larger now because they have this like these larger entities that have like increased profits and larger scale profits, and as a result have just more money to invest in these instances, right? The impact of this is that we're unlocking like the monopoly benefits, but we're also becoming the supplier of choice, right? As a result of this, we're going to see that political will for like electric vehicles As a result of this, right, we're going to see that like political desire from other companies, or other countries rather, to take and export from China is going to increase just because of the general trend in like Western nations in general to shift towards like cleaner energy and electric vehicles. And as a result of this, you're likely to see more political saliency over nations that are looking to invest in EVs, that are looking to do these things, right? It also just strengthens perceptions of China as a major investor into like the economic, into the environment, right? Firstly, international companies now will look to them for investment in terms of like transitioning to clean energy, right? Which means that China has now control not only of the electric vehicle market, but just more general markets as a whole. Secondly, it means they get to sell technology and patents to these companies, right? And they are able to also encourage like fostering patent trading schemes, which just benefits technology in general for China overall as a result of like the monopolization of this industry. I think what we need to do here is weigh specifically under the context that we are in. China is at its first ever period of significant slowing economic growth in a very, very long time. As such, the CCP is now, as an actor, is seeking to increase this, right? Because the political and economic motives are entirely dependent on this fact. And we're so happy to propose. Thank you.
The Great Leap Forward is unpopular because it killed millions of Chinese people. The Chinese Revolution occurred because literally millions upon millions of people lived in serfdom, lived in abject poverty, lived in the absence of the immense economic development that the CCP has brought them over the last couple of decades. I think it is an insane assertion from this negative team that opposition to this policy could potentially lead to another revolution, that it could potentially lead to another Great Leap Forward. I think that if that is where they want to hinge this case, they have sorely missed the meat of this debate. Two contributions in this speech. Firstly, on internal political perception, because if this is where negative wants to hinge their case, I'm happy to let them do it. Secondly, on the extent to which China is able to monopolize. Let's talk about internal political perception. Second negative, we hear that this is the most important thing that the CCP cares about, and that as a result of this being unpopular, it will lose us this debate. A couple of things to explain here. The first thing is just that this negative team fails to ever establish the extreme political salience of the car market in China. I think it is incredibly unclear that this ever leads to a revolution. There are many consumer goods and services markets in China. It is entirely unclear why this one is the tipping point for the CCP potentially losing their power. The second thing that I would explain is that they never explain the salience of this specific policy, except that it is potentially bad if it fails. The first thing that I would say is that it obviously is already politically normalized if, as they say at first negative, many industries have been consolidated and conglomerated. It's unclear to me why this is necessarily perceived as highly economically risky by the Chinese population, given that this is something that has been inculcated into the political and economic China of culture generally. The second thing that I would say is that would just explain extensively why this likely does work and therefore never becomes something that is perceived as politically risky. I'll get into the additional responses to first and second on that in a second. The last thing that I would say is that as much as this negative team wants to run away from this, the CCP is an immensely powerful political actor that literally just can crush dissent most of the time. I think it is always asserted that the CCP fears losing their power forever. I would like this negative team to point to the potential alternative to the CCP in China, one that could ever get up over a policy that happens in one singular market that most people in this country do not care about. This political argument is entirely asserted, it is blatantly under-mechanized, and it is too late at third for Jack to attempt to mechanize it for the first time. Let's talk about the extent to which China is able to monopolize. We explained to you at first affirmative that when you consolidate, you access economies of scale, you enhance your R&D capacity, you get much higher quality assurance, and you can do all of this at significantly lower initial cost and lower consumer price. Negative has three broad responses. The first thing they say is that you don't need to do this. The second thing that they say is that you lose the benefits of diversity and supply chain diversification. The third thing that they say is that there's international backlash that precludes effective monopolization. Let's firstly talk about necessity, because I would note that this is where this negative team, again, hinges the vast majority of their case. They tell you that you don't need to do this, that things are already fucking awesome. The first thing that I would say is that the panicked cost cutting that you see in the status quo does just indicate that the trajectory of growth in the market is slowing and that the Chinese market share is shrinking. That is why corporations corporations are trading off the potential prices that they could raise with trying to hold on to the market share that this negative team says that they have. And I think that that probably just indicates that there is some degree of internal perception that firstly, things are maybe not awesome right now, but that even if they are, that is likely to decrease in the future, and so companies are trying to do things that safeguard their extent of market share, which I think means that the picture is not as rosy as this negative team paints it to be. The second thing that I would say is that even if this was untrue, the specific economic moment we're in does just necessitate this. The Chinese economy is slowing down, so it is obviously within the CCP's interest to capitalize on markets that are specifically profitable and industries that they think might be economically useful to them in the future, as this negative team tells you it will be. And I think that this probably does answer the lovely question that Josie poses to us at one end, which is, why would you do this now? The answer is that you do this now to capitalize on the situation that this negative team outlines, just as they did at similar moments for telecommunications, just as they did at similar moments for other manufacturing industries. I think this is obviously the answer. The answer is not that, oh, like, you didn't do it 10 years ago. It's because there weren't fucking electric vehicles 10 years ago. That is the answer to the question. The second thing that I would say, or the third thing rather, is that obviously this is politically necessary at the moment. The perception of the economy slowing down, of increasing international manufacturing encroachment into this market is also politically impalatable. And I think that one end tells you that perceived economic instability is bad. I think one of the biggest indicators of perceived economic instability is an oversaturation of foreign manufacturers in your market who do not put their revenue back into your economy, who do not help you, who probably do not even employ that many people who are from China, whose cars are sold on markets that you as a Chinese person cannot access. I think that coupled with the fact that your economy is slowing down at a quicker rate than it ever has before, is probably the actual thing that freaks you out. It's not the fact that the Chinese government does something that has worked for other industries that you're already politically used to. And I think that what that means is that this is the necessary policy at this precise political and economic moment on the very metrics that this negative team provides, as well as the factual metric that we provide to you at First Affirmative. Secondly then, let's talk about diversity. Panel, let's be really, really grown up about this. It is obviously not within the Chinese government's interest to make one massive fuck-off EV manufacturing company. Obviously, they are likely to consolidate and conglomerate the 300 corporations that they currently have into multiple stronger conglomerates for a variety of reasons, which are the ones that this negative team provides. Because people do want to be able to buy different types of cars, because people are perhaps interested in the different brands of cars, because there is variation in the amount of luxury vehicles you want in the market as opposed to the amount of like fucking family RVs that you want in the market. I think that obviously means that all of this material about how one big company is bad is true, but is largely irrelevant, because obviously the CCP would not do it in that way. That is not how they have done it in other industries. The second thing that I would say is that obviously supply chain diversity is just good practice. And again, I would note that this negative team never explains why the CCP is likely to engage in this policy badly. And I think that if it is true that this is potentially politically risky, that this might lead to bad things if you get it wrong, then the CCP probably just weighs these risks in such a way that means they design their supply chains in a way that will not lead to these harms. Whether that is that you just still do have multiple supplies of lithium and cobalt, whether that is that you have parts that are stored in various warehouses, whether that is the fact that you just create multiple conglomerates instead of one big conglomerate. I see no reason why you can't conglomerate 10 conglomerates out of the 300 car companies that you already have. I think that's perfectly reasonable. The third thing that I would explain is that we explain to you that you can monopolize control over those supply chains, which because conglomerations require infrastructure for supply chains, which means that now you get the added political and economic benefit that Jay tells you about that goes entirely unresponded to in that second negative speech. Lastly then, let's talk about international economic and political backlash. Firstly, negative never explains why prices for international consumers don't decrease, at least initially. And I would note that for any uncertainty mechanization to work, which is where all of their political and economic harms are hinged, then you must acknowledge that at least the initial economies of scale work, that at least they are somewhat profitable in the ether. I think that what that means is that there is, even in our worst case, an initial and medium-term decrease in consumer prices for international and domestic consumers. I think that what that means, firstly, is you just are able to raise significantly more revenue. Those companies get taxed at a much higher rate. They're able to put more money back into your pocket. That is a great thing. The next thing that I would say is that Ned never explains why, if international markets are so good for China at the moment, and they're cutting off other companies' access to those markets, why people actually negatively perceive Chinese companies to the extent that they do. If this was true, then obviously all of their mechanization would fail, but it is false. Vote back.
You guys get that's good. Firstly, on maintaining what you have, then on getting more. Firstly, on maintaining what you have, I'm going to begin by explaining the most important thing for the CCP is just avoiding risk. And yes, obviously, as we say, there's 30%, like, we're not arguing that a revolution is going to occur. The point of this characterization is to explain the CCP understands that the source of its legitimacy, as explained in that speech, is the economic development it's bringing to people, is the fact that it has given them consumer goods that they did not previously access, and that it is a pathological fear of what will happen if it stops being able to provide those goods. And I think notably, as I think is kind of implicit in that case, there are kind of a couple of big key goods that people care about. Like, think about what the average person thinks about when they consider my life has gotten better than my grandparents' life. Probably it's your house, probably it's your car. Kind of the big ticket items that people own that enable them to do things like travel around the country, that enable them to do things like have status, that enable them to do things like be important. The housing market, as is explained by this affirmative team, is fucked. It's falling apart. There's literally a collapse of property developers as we speak. There's a remaining grounding of legitimacy, which is people say, two generations ago, my family traveled by horse and cart. They barely left their province. Now we have cars. It's easy for us to travel. I have this status in my life. It's gotten better. I like the CCP. So whether or not you think a revolution is likely, what we've explained is that throughout the history of the party, they have a pathological fear, a pathological need to prove economic growth and development to people, which is why avoiding the risk of that happening is their central interest, which has been claimed from negative from the end. And I would employ you to be charitable there, but I would also employ you to be comparative, because their claim is, well, the chance of revolution doesn't scale. It's either revolution or nothing. Obviously it scales, right? Like, obviously, if people are unhappy with the government, they comply with its directives less, they like it less, the government is less secure, they have to do more censorship, people online criticize them, the leaders feel more insecure, the government just feels like it has less control of the country, it has less strength, its ideology is not strong. Like, all of these can happen to a marginal extent. This obviously scales. Compare that to their argument. And I think actually at the end of this debate, the benefits they prove are really, really uncertain. Because the claim from first is, we make a bit extra tax money. And then they're like, oh bro, like the Chinese government spends on like the BRI, I guess we can do that, hey. But they don't actually prove how much extra tax money they get, right? Like you have to prove a massive increase in profits for their corporate tax to be the percentage of that, to actually be very meaningful. And I don't think they prove why Chinese government is lacking money, right? Like the Chinese government has a shit ton of money, we all know this. I think what it lacks is legitimacy, what it lacks is an ability to show to the people that their lives can get better. They say, well, why does the car market matter? I've already explained why it does, because it's one of the key goods that people can point to as, this is what is different from my parents. They say, well, this policy is normalized. Perhaps, but this isn't about whether the policy is popular or not. It's about the risk of shocks which impact these industries in the same way that the property market was at risk of shock and then fell apart. Then they say we can crush dissent. I think this is silly. Obviously the Chinese this isn't about a revolution. It's just about local dissent, it's about local ways of disengaging with the state, it's about local people having less faith in the government. Why does Side Affirmative introduce risk factors into the market? There are three potential risk factors. The first is a prompting of a US response. And this argument is dealt with unbelievably uncharitably by this affirmative team. Right? The argument is so simple. It's like the US looks at Huawei and it looks at TikTok and they're like, damn, those are the Chinese state companies, firms. What we're going to do is drop FDPRs, foreign direct product regulations, on them. We're going to stop them from having suppliers. We're going to stop them from engaging. We're going to ban government employees from owning them. We're just going to restrict them wherever possible. Because there's such a bipartisan consensus among the US, and also like Britain, which did this, and Australia, which did this, so many other Western countries, to just restrict this. And the only response is like, well, like African countries still have Huawei. But the problem with this is that the US and like the West's response to do things like restrict their capacity to access suppliers all around the world means that the company suffers. So even if it can still export to, for example, Africa, it can't import from them because African suppliers want to maintain good relationships with the US, so they don't do deals with their superpower. That's a huge supply shock. Then that's a huge shock. Second thing we explain, you're more vulnerable to supply shocks because you have a less diversified economy. And they then say, well, we would just buy from many different things. This is literally like a gigantic tension we point out in a second to get the response. They say it first and defend it third, economies of scale. This is used as a buzzword, it is never substantiated.
What economies of scale means is you can buy in bulk and produce in bulk from one supplier, rather than having to purchase from many different ones. But if you are buying in bulk from one supplier, which is getting you the economies of scale, then you are more dependent on supply shocks, right? You're more dependent on buying all of the ones from the Congo and pouring infrastructure to clean out the Congo. And so if the Congo gets upset at you, then you just lose all your investments. Final thing we say is you can hedge your bets. And just use your imagination here, right? Think of all of the things that can go wrong with the company. You can have financial mismanagement. Jack Ma can get up and say something stupid. Like, anything could go wrong to take down this company. And so, if there's only one company that is nationally central to your entire car system, and it goes down, or becomes massively unprofitable, or the CCP decides to fucking hate it because like Xi Jinping, decides some other policy, that is devastating for you, because now your consumers cannot afford cars, or the price of quality of cars goes massively up. That explains, I think, the debate winning benefit. Let's talk about the thing they want to talk about, which is getting more. First question I'm going to ask, where are you able to produce better and cheaper cars? First claim is they're like, oh, the oversaturation of other cars into the market is scary. Firstly, I do not actually buy that there are that many other cars competing with the Chinese cars. Like, they operate in different lenses, right? Like, if you're really rich, you buy a Tesla. If you're less rich, you might buy BYD. It's unclear they're competing on the same price range. So this is actually scary. Secondly, I don't get why it's scary, right? Like, they're cooperating with China. I don't understand why this is scary. Second thing they say is they give 4 reasons to prove that there's a natural monopoly in the car market, so conglomerates make a lot of sense. This is just not proven, right? What they prove is that this is an oligopolistic market. And they point to the US, which is an oligopolistic market where there are a few quite large car firms. And that's what we're defending, right? We're defending a number of different large car firms in China. What they're defending is one nationalized huge car firm, right? Your argument proves an oligopoly. High fixed costs proves you need to have large car firms. BYD, pretty fucking large. But what it doesn't prove is that you need to have one car firm that dominates the rest. But their arguments as to why you need to produce better and cheaper are just quite suspicious. They say economies of scale. This is not proven. I think it's attached with the rest of their material. But I just actually don't understand what this looks like. Like, they say cars have high fixed costs. What are those high fixed costs? Never told to me. Are they metal? Seems pretty cheap. Is it the labor? Seems pretty cheap. I don't know. Second thing they say is you can share tech. Firstly, the CCP already forces its companies to share tech. You can do this symmetrically. But secondly, I actually don't think this is that necessary, for the reason that EV development technology comes from science and then is applied to cars, so tech isn't that important. Third thing they say is you can get leverage over suppliers. This is symmetric, because a bunch of them can just band together and go leverage suppliers if they wanted to. But secondly, I think we flip this, because I think we explain you have more political leverage over suppliers at the point where, under our side, you can specialize, right? BYD mostly specializes in Thailand. If you go to Thailand and you try and buy an EV, you'll buy it from BYD. Verse, on their side, the same thing happens, right? It's symmetric, because they may have one company specializing in BYD, but in Thailand, but the same thing is already happening under our side. What you have to weigh that against is firstly our claims, which is just that competition drives down prices, means better strategies, it means you're more efficient in all of the ways that communist national monopolies were very inefficient, and capitalist systems unfortunately do just produce more competitive results. Final thing to note, and I think the deadlock break that if you're confused here, is under which side do you have more of an incentive to make these cars high quality? Because they say, well, the CCP can force you to make the cars high quality. No, actually that's the reverse. The CCP has much less power over one large company than they do over 6 small ones. That's why they broke up Alibaba into 6 small companies rather than leave it as one when they wanted more control. What we explain is that there's now an incentive, a competitive incentive, to reform, to stop having corruption, to produce better quality cars, to actually produce cheaper cars, which means that workers like you. That is the most important thing in the debate. Not whether you can produce good cars if you try maximally, but whether you're going to try maximally. And we explain that when you have a competitive mechanism pushing you, rather than a lazy natural monopoly, then you're likely to get a more competitive cars and cheaper goods. Proud to oppose.
You back, Rob?
Took me back.
To your debating days?
A little bit. I was on best recordings in those days.
You're good to go.
All right, thank you. Hi, Rob. Thank you all very much for today. That was a really high quality debate. One of the best debates I've seen this Easter, so both of you are very, very proud of their performance. And I think it was also quite an interesting debate too, with lots of facts discussed. And we quite enjoyed it. So, what we're going to do general feedback, result, reasons for the result. General feedback, I think there's there's not much in this debate because of how good it was. But the first thing I note is there are, I think, some examples of times where there is better material from teams coming out that is not fully or properly engaged with, which at times makes the weighing a little bit difficult for the panel of deciding between what should we value is more important. So do making sure you are, if not directly rebutting the best case of the team, trying to trade it off or weigh it off. I guess to give the most general example of this debate, economic, be international harms, etc., would be a good thing. But both teams to try and trade off a little bit in the debate, both as a last response, but also as a way for the judge to think about how to judge the debate. I think the second thing I'd say is trying to engage in the debate in the best good faith about how the model and the world would work, both in setting it up and being clear, but also responding to that version as well. So I think that does become important and impactful in the result. That's how you go for very good debate. Happy to change individually if you don't have questions or give more individual feedback. In terms of the result, then we ultimately have a unanimous decision and board today's debate decided affirmative. Congratulations. So I think there are broadly three issues. I want to look at what the CCP's strongest interests are, and that will feed mostly into the stability aspect that Nick talks about. I then want to talk about the economic benefits, and then looking at that, comparing that up against the international response. Let's start here with the CCP and what their primary interests are. I'm just mainly going to focus on the stability aspect that Nick talks about here, because I think they do a reasonable job of explaining why the CCP is likely to prioritise stability as its biggest concern overall. Probably fair, not really to the revolution kind of stuff we hear that from AF, but I think there's still a risk there of like some sort of political dissidence, some sort of concern, and they want to avoid all of that. However, in terms of how this actually factors into debate, that entirely just becomes a proxy question for how successful it's going to be economically or how the international relations are. Because if those things are good or bad, then it errs to negative. If those things are bad, like it errs to negative. If things are good, it errs to AF. So it all doesn't become a contentious or a decisive issue in the debate, but it's just proxy framing for how the rest of the debate actually occurs, which means that I think to the extent that even if AF loses the idea of like economics being the primary thing the CCP cares about, because those economic things help or don't actually come at a cost of stability, they're still able to get a pathway to win the debate. So I wanted to frame it as important, but I think the main clashes actually occur in the next two issues. So let's definitely look then at the economic benefits that are likely to occur. I think the important question to start here with is actually there an issue in the status quo that needs us to take action in the first place? This is the push coming from Neg, that actually everything's going particularly well so far. These 300 companies are doing good, they're producing a lot of cheap vehicles, and the economy is growing, so the market is growing. So we don't need to worry about introducing a change and potentially disrupt that. I think AF has a number of responses here that maybe suggest that the market isn't as good as Neg wants to assume, that means we didn't make a change. The first of those is by looking at just at the info slide. So we hear the clarification and around how the dropping of prices to increase market share that is mentioned in the info slide is actually a symptom of the fact that they're struggling to compete against each other, to compete against the foreign markets, which means that there is a problem here. I think secondly, they also point to a broader economic context of China around slowing growth and a shrinking economy, which means you need to do, and given how big this market is, you need to do something to help kickstart that economy and keep it going, and currently all these businesses operating so inefficiently and dropping their prices is hurting that. And I think thirdly, even if we don't believe that to its fullest extent, they provide, as we'll go into in a second, a bunch of benefits as to why we can still do better all these companies merging together rather than being separate. So I think at the end of this first question, I'm not super convinced the status quo is perfect, but I am, and I think that the Neg is able to show, sorry, AF is able to show it can get better. Because I'm standing here now, you're on different perspectives, which is making it a bit harder to get the names right. So the second question of economic benefit then is how do we actually improve or increase the economic capacity of these companies and of the country overall? I think AF does a good job here of explaining why condensing all these companies together is quite useful. I think the one thing I want to flag here is how many companies are we condensing to? Because this becomes, I think, a clearest third affirmative, where it's like, obviously it's not just one massive nationalized company for everything, it'd be like 6 or 10 or a smaller group, but just a significant reduction from 300. I think this should have been more explicitly clear earlier in the affirmative case. Ultimately though, how does the panel resolve this question? I think the first thing is, given it did come out at third app, it is still plenty of time for Neg to respond, and I think more needed to be done for Neg to explain why all those harms still were present in a conception of like 6 to 10 rather than 300, and I think unfortunately Neg still pushes harder almost on the one company aspect of this. I think the second thing is it's implicit enough in the analysis and responses given to things like diversification, supply chains, etc., that the AF is not talking about just one company throughout the rest of their case. And the third reason we're willing to side with AF on this question is that even if we don't believe the first two, I think it's still a very reasonable response to come out and say, well, okay, even if that one company is not going to work, we can still do this thing here that avoids those harms. Even as a response, a piece of rebuttal, it's still enough to show why they can still do the model and achieve the benefits out of that model. So I think the comparative here actually is not one nationalized company 300 into one, but 300 into like a smaller group of companies. Oh, and the other reason I think it's so plausible is just the reasons given as to why this is the most likely way it would be done in terms of like luxury vehicles or independent vehicles or different market shares, etc. All make very reasonable claims as to why it would likely look this way. So that means I think then so that impact, I think the next level issue is quite a lot. Because we're now talking about these companies, I think the first thing it does in terms of economic impacts, on terms of a diversification of the supply chains, etc., I think actually helps our figures able to say that we can still reduce all of the many different supply chains we've got into a couple, and that gives us our first level of economies of scale benefit. I would also note the panel thought that I have to be a bit clearer on economies of scale, and although I relying a little bit less on the buzzword, but there is enough that comes out in the various points that still stands to act. Because the attack we get on this from Neg is that, well, being too reliant on one is actually going to be very harmful, but that goes belly up, because then we've got reduced supply chains and we've got a greater risk of all the companies falling down. I guess one is mitigated by the fact that if one falls down, there's still others, but also it's likely to not operate in a way that is really bad, where they have multiple different, so there's only one supplier. We're likely to still have a diversity of suppliers in multiple batteries in, but still significantly less than they otherwise had. And also still enabling access to the economies of scale better, because they can still order on bulk. So I think it's not reliant on ordering everything from one supplier from one company, as Neg tries to characterize it, but it's still reliant on ordering from 6 to 6 companies instead of the 300 that currently exist. I think as well there's also stuff that comes out first that doesn't get a whole lot of, I think either whipping or engagement stuff around reducing management levels and reducing other inefficiencies that exist when you have multiple companies competing against each other, rather than narrowing it down into one. So I think at the end of this, what we have here, I think, is an economic situation where if they're all merged together, we can still have the benefits of hedging against risk and hedging against the economic consequences of supply chain issues, but we are actually more shored up against those worst cases as well, because we have stronger, bigger companies able to make things cheaper. And that is then the big benefit they get in terms of economics, is they can just produce much cheaper cars because they're all conglomerated now, without the risk of those companies going broke or having issues themselves. So they can better provide services to the Chinese and the local domestic consumers, but also compete better in the international market against the other threats they're facing as well. So in terms of economic benefits, then we think we've got a better outcome now from the CCP taking this action. The very last thing on this is it doesn't become a huge contention in the debate, but I think access have a bunch of reasons as to why the CCP can do this, and it will be likely to be popular and successful, given the fact that the local consumers have already done, the local domestic market has already seen this happen by other companies before, and the CCP has experience doing it, so I think it can actually occur and work. And that also then reduces the stability question as well, because if we don't think it's going to go economically bad, that is the only mechanism I think app has as to why it would lead to instability. So given that it's been proven to go well, that mechanism doesn't kick in for the stability argument either. Last thing on international response, this is where the general feedback that I mentioned at the start about weighing things could have been a little bit better, but we'll go into it anyway. So the biggest claim we get here from affirmative is that this is going to anger the USA because they don't want to have big threats of big Chinese companies. I think the problem we have here is that the way this is proven by Neg to say, well, they're scared of big Chinese companies, look at TikTok, look at Huawei, without actually explaining why these cars would, like a car market would have the same sort of incentives or reasoning to lead to the same outcome of being banned or being restricted, or having, I forget the acronym that was used back then, negative, but the product import and bans, etc., put on them to operate the same way. I think without a bit more explanation as to why that would be so analogous, it was hard to believe that claim overall. I guess without us stepping too much into the debate as a panel and being like, oh, it's sensitive technology, all these new electric vehicles have Bluetooth, etc. in them. But we didn't think we couldn't step in that fast. We're like, potentially the USA gets a little bit angry, but we're not sure if just because they've done it here, they would do it in other places as well. But I think ACT also has some responses as to why this is unlikely to be as bad a response. The first is the point that they can shop to other markets, the domestic market, there's markets in the continent of Africa and other areas with the BRI project where they're reaching and having these access to suppliers. But secondly, purchases, but secondly, that because the prices are likely to be so low, there's likely to be, it's going to be very popular to have these cars because they're so cheap, which means it undercuts any sort of political pressure or demand to take action against this, because the consumers are actually happy with the product they are receiving. So maybe the USA gets a little bit angry, not assuming it's at least a ban. Even if it does, there are alternatives that exist. The last time we get international response here from Neg is this idea that, well, actually supplies the rare earth minerals and stuff that we need, like cobalt, etc., will get angry and not supply China because they don't want to piss off the USA as a consequence of this. The problem with this was it's just asserted that these countries would automatically prefer the USA over China as a supplier. All of it immediately comes at a mutually exclusive cost between the two. And as a point of feedback, I think why the USA be having 300 different competitors accessing this cobalt versus 1 or 10, I think also needs to be a little bit more stepped out. But in any case, I think it's still a bit of that there'll be this much shock to the supply markets from Africa as well. So I think in terms of the international response, there's not enough here proven from neg as a big enough concern to outweigh the economic benefits we get. And because of those two factors massively shrinking the risk factors involved in this, I think that shifts the stability risk weighting from neg to work in Firmly's favour, and hence because of all that, Firmly wins the debate. Hope that all made sense. If anyone has any questions or any feedback, feel free to shut myself or either of the panelists, but I would prefer we do it walking, talking, so that we don't get in trouble for being late around things. So thank you everyone, good luck for the round.